good evening. I'm Melissa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. It's exactly a year since the floods in December 2021. That disaster had left more than 50 dead. It had required the evacuation of about 400,000 people, and it resulted in an overall estimated financial losses of more than 6 billion ringgit. Heavy rains in the past few weeks have also heightened the risk of flooding and landslides, like the deadly tragedy at the campsite near Batang Kali in Selangor. Now, disasters like these are likely to reoccur, but are we better prepared now? Have we learned the lessons of how to cope with when disaster strikes during the monsoon season? My first guest today is Ko Charlie. She is the founder and CEO of Urbanmetry, which is a data company which uses proprietary algorithms to analyze big data from cities to help governments, city planners, corporations and city dwellers to better understand the cities we live in. So Charlie, thank you so much for joining me on the show today. If we were to take into account some of the extreme weather that we've been experiencing, weather that seems to get increasingly worse each year, what do you understand about why some places flood worse than others?
Right. So thank you so much for having me on the show. I just, before we begin, I think the question around floods is, and also landslides and all these incidents confuses people because they kind of lump it together. But I would generally want to guide people into three different issues, and they're quite separate, right? So climate change is happening. The world is warming up, and as a result, we have sea level rise. So sea level rise is something all climate scientists talk about. People talk about how many centimeters or even half a meter, like types of increase in terms of height in water, sea level rises. And people don't think about that very much. They think, climate change, polar bears in the Arctics, right? But actually, it really, really affects us, primarily because a lot of our cities are built around rivers. Okay, people don't realize this, but like our Klang River, the Bangkok River, many cities around the world are built around the river because that's how we used to trade. As civilizations, that's where we do. So why does the river have to do with sea level rise? Sea level rise, when it happens, it actually pushes not just the coast. So if you think about a peninsula and the water going up, it doesn't just affect the coast, but it pushes the water all the way up river. So when you do that, so think about it as your pipes, right? So think of a river in a very simple way as your pipes. If the water starts to swell up and fill up all your pipes, then it pushes all water all the way up to all your cities, into all your drains. Everything will have less capacity. So if you have a smaller tank, in a way, for the water to run off, then the water will get stuck in the city.
Okay.
Does it make sense? So yeah. It's like, yeah. So you have an aquarium, right? But the aquarium is all full now. So whatever you thought that you could actually drain out into the aquarium doesn't go into the aquarium anymore. It actually overflows, right, into the city. So a lot of people, when they think about floods, they don't realize that it's actually three distinct things. One, the coastal floods. You're talking about Klang, you're talking about Sakinchan, you're talking about your Kuantan areas where it's around the coast. But then as you go upriver into like Klang Valley, into PJ, into KL, it is really two effects. One is the water being pushed up, and there's not enough room for the water to run off. And also, of course, the amount of tar and development that we're doing into the cities, that's not allowing the earth to actually absorb a lot of this water.
Okay, and what's so that's coastal floods. I can understand in estuaries where cities are built around estuaries, they're affected and can be flood prone. What about other areas that are not near estuaries, that are more inland? How come they flood as well?
So so as you go upwards towards the inlands, which is actually KL is pretty far inland, then you will have the effects of drainage, right? So then the rain, the incessant rain and the erratic rain that we are seeing, which is bigger drought area times, so we have a longer amount of like dry times, and also more rain that's coming at the same time. So we have this sort of like large amount of rains and then no rain, right? So things are actually getting compressed a lot. So we are seeing centimeters of rain per year going higher and higher and higher, and our drains cannot cope with this kind of erratic climate, right? And that's one of the effects of climate change as well.
So let's focus on flooding when it happens in urban areas. We've seen last year Taman Sri Muda, Shah Alam, Kuala Lumpur, all these areas were inundated with water. What were some of the things from last year that we can learn? Because the risk is it might happen again this year. So what were the main lessons that we can take away from last year's floodings?
So again, the two areas we talked about, Taman Sri Muda, unfortunately, is going to be affected by annual floods due to climate sea level rise. So the models are showing that the water that's rising is going to push the river up, and Taman Sri Muda, being a low-lying land, is going to unfortunately be susceptible to repeated flooding unless very drastic measures are being done, right? Kuala Lumpur, which is much higher up north, have the issue of not being able to absorb the amount of rain or sudden rain that's happening. And that's slightly different from the coastal floods. That could be engineered away or increase better types of water management system, or what we call MASMA, the sponge city concept, can be adopted up north, North River, right? So when you're going upriver into the Klang, Kuala Lumpur areas, those would be an ideal solution. But when you're downriver, it becomes more and more difficult, primarily because you can't really fight the sea, and to fight the sea is actually a very expensive endeavor.
Right. So you founded a big data company, Charlie. Are there ways in which we can better use technology to forecast disasters before it happens, reduce the risk, or even mitigate some of the impact if that disasters do strike?
That's a good question. So we are not a hydrodynamic engineering company, and there's very, very good hydrodynamic engineering companies out there who specialize in river and water management in the city. What we actually do is we accumulate a lot of data, and one of the data sources that we got was from international climate scientists who has modeled actually the effects of sea level rise and annual floods very well, right? So these are not sort of like state-of-the-art technology. It is state-of-the-art technology, but it's not something that has not been invented. Unfortunately, this forecast is not actively being used by stakeholders. So no matter how good the technology is, it's as good as the user. So if the active stakeholders like governments, banks, property developers, local councils, they need to start recognizing that the floods is going to be a problem for a lot of us in a lot of our councils, and they need to start to think about how to take active policies to safeguard the citizens from these impending floods. So we can't always engineer ourselves out of it, but sometimes some policies like preventing development in flood-prone areas, or preventing people from actually moving to these areas or increasingly moving to these areas could be something that they start to think about. Or some countries in the world actually start buying people out of floodplains. That is very expensive. And most governments in emerging markets will say that's crazy. If that's not an option, we could talk about insurance, right? So many, many options, but we have to start talking about them. Not all of them are viable for our country, but at least recognize that these are actually an issue for people, and start safeguarding those who are most vulnerable.
Could I ask you, I mean, just now you said fighting the sea is impossible. It's impossible. So if we talk about estuary cities or even high-density urban areas, what then should we be talking about if buying out these high-risk areas may not be an option for Malaysia at this point? What would effective flood mitigation measures and adaptation for resilience measures look like, do you think?
So I think if you are very, very close to the coast, your options are actually quite limited, other than, thinking about short-term measures around raising your home's levels, things more like renovation around stilts, moving yourself to the second floor, that sort of thing. But it's not exactly very sustainable. I would actually advise people to start thinking about moving higher upland if you don't want to have a long-term financial burden. It's actually much cheaper to think about relocating at this point in time versus trying to sort of build your way out of the situation, because that's very, very expensive. So I think some of these thinking, especially for the vulnerable group, they might not be so apt in doing it because they see their options as being limited. And that's where government comes in, and that's where local councils come in. They have to start guiding us around these decisions.
Charlie, can I ask you the correlation between these disaster-prone areas and property and property prices? Will we see? Will we see a situation where the rich and the wealthy live higher up and inland, whereas the more vulnerable, the poorer, the marginalized, they live lower laying areas? Do you think that's a possibility?
Yeah, I think unfortunately that's already the case. So if you think about all the high-end areas that you know of, they always have the word bukit in front, right? Because being on the highland has traditionally, throughout our civilization, to be a premium in general, right? So that's across all cultures, across civilizations. What we are afraid of now is that those people who are beginning to be exposed to floods don't have the resources to relocate, which means that they are kind of stuck. I want to relocate, but I don't have the financial ability to do so, right? So think Parasite, the movie, right? Where you're kind of stuck, right? So those are the things that we have to start thinking as a society, how we help our fellow Malaysians to think around this issue. That's one. The second thing is there is a different impact on property prices. So for example, our numbers kind of show that if you, or we are suspecting that your house is already at a low end price, like let's say at the bottom of the tier, there is nowhere for the price to even drop anymore. So we see the price to be quite stable, but people don't really want to buy your house. But the people who actually have the bungalows and semis and they're in flood-prone areas, they have the most to lose because the price could really drop because they are already at a higher level of price, right? So different property ranges have different impacts. Just because your home price have not moved doesn't mean that it's not impacted. It just means that it's not desirable. And of course, it impacts the property. Who wants to live in a flood-prone area, right? It also means that it's very hard for you to liquidate your asset, right? And these people will get trapped in those locations.
Right. Charlie, thank you so much for speaking with me. I really appreciate it. Coach Charlie from Urban Metri there. We're going to take a quick break here on Consider This. We will be back with more. Stay tuned. Hi, welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris. Heavy rains in the past few weeks have now heightened the risk of flooding and landslides. We've already seen the deadly tragedy at the campsite in Batang Kali in Selangor. Now, it's almost exactly a year from the December 2021 floods. Are we better prepared for this monsoon season, which this year is coupled with the La Nina phenomenon? Joining me now on the show is Dr. Nurul Ashikin Mabawi. She's a researcher in flood risk management. Dr. Ashikin, thank you for joining me on the show. You know, when we talk about extreme weather phenomena, we know that with the monsoon season, it happens almost every year. I mean, you know, annual monsoons flood the east coast of Peninsular Malaysia. It's Sabah, Sarawak. It's become such a regular occurrence that the response to inundation is often like clockwork. But when you couple that with an extreme weather phenomenon, and that results in flooding or landslides, can we plan for that? Can we forecast that? Are there limits to what we can plan, for, and what we can't plan for?
Mhm. Actually, we can plan everything in flood risk management because we already know the three things that influence flood risk. The first one is our rainfall intensity in Malaysia is extremely high all year round, and our country's urban areas are vulnerable to flash floods, and our north, central, east, and south region will experience flooding during the monsoon season from around May to August due to southwest monsoon, and from around November to February due to northeast monsoon. And I would like for us to recommend, and we can definitely plan for every flood mitigation or flood preparedness, we must consider the climate change, and any mitigation project that we want to do must be able to withstand flooding of at least 100, the best is 500 years flood projection. And what I would like to emphasize is that projection and simulation are very important. So we must always refer to the average recurrence interval, the ARI, meaning that the possibility of large-scale flooding that will occur every 100 years or maybe earlier than that. And if we prepare ourselves with proper mitigation based on projection, we can plan to minimize the flood risk in our country. And other thing that we can plan, and in Malaysia, it's normal to have secondary disaster. In this context, is landslides due to heavy rain and flooding. So we can start now by integrating the urban planning or spatial planning with flood risk management, because this will help us to combat with climate change and to build up a resilient city. And for me, flood risk management is something that we can plan and manage, but it's going to involve a lot of stakeholders lah.
Yeah, so I didn't realize you would have to plan for 100 years, in the future. That's a long time and a lot of things to consider. As you pointed out, there are a lot of stakeholders in this. So when you think about planning and preparedness, you have to involve everyone. It's not just you can't be working in silos. How important is coordination, particularly between different agencies, different stakeholders, not just at the local level, but also from federal down to state and almost at every level?
In Malaysia, our flood risk management has been a top-down government responsibility, and we rely 100% on the government approach to manage flood risk. But the flood risk governance and flood risk management in Malaysia is divided between the federal government, the state government, and the district government. And at each of these divisions, the flood risk management is subject to different legal framework, different rules, different policies, different procedural standards, and different work practice. But what interesting is that the primary coordination and the disaster funding, the order and the crisis management responsibilities remain at the federal level. So that is why in Malaysia, the flood risk management is not just about flood risk, but it also comprises a very specific government system that includes management of perspective, combining prevention, response, recovery.
Right. Dr. Shein, sorry if I may quickly jump in there. So you're saying that at every level, everyone's operating on different rules, they're operating with different processes, SOPs. What is the reason for this? And do you recommend more decentralization, or is a bird's eye view the better approach?
I would like us to improve, and I think for now, because the problem with flood risk management is that when it comes to land matter, for us to implement any structural measures, it relies under the jurisdiction of state government, but the funding lies under the jurisdiction of federal government. So I think this is where we come into one problem and clash between these two sets of government level. And I wrote a paper about issues and challenges of flood-related agencies, because by looking at the loophole in flood-related agencies, we can improvise for them for the flood risk management to be more comprehensive, and somehow we can manage the flood risk better. Especially if we want to implement structural measures that will include the land rights and jurisdiction under the state level.
Well, may I ask you what you found in that paper? What were some of the things that you would like to see improved? Was it simply just jurisdiction of who handles what?
The first problem is the directive number 20, because it is not it is just a written order. It's not a law.
What is directive number 20?
Arahan nombor 20 is like one document, executive order from the Prime Minister office that our country will use. And when it is activated, then we can declare that we are having disaster, having flood. From directive number 20 is the role of NADMA as coordinator. So this is the first problem actually. For example, for last year flood, when NADMA declared quite late, and the responders cannot act, so it led to delay in operation. And I also found in my study that we have a problem with lack of manpower, because all officers in district office and state office, they have to be on duty during flood operation, but at the same time, they are also the flood victims. And we are having problem with lack of assets and logistics. And in terms of kebenaran merancang in the urban planning process, Jabatan Pengairan, Jabatan Pengairan dan Saliran, they can just provide technical advice, but they can't reject any development, even though if the development can lead to another flooding or is not sustainable for the environment. So this is a part of the problem that we found in the study, because they can just advise, giving technical aspect, but they can't reject the kebenaran merancang, etc. So actually it's very complex. So we need to, buat rombakan yang sangat banyak.
Okay, that's a good point. I think it merits a longer conversation, but also more in-depth research into it. Dr. Ashikin, the Central Disaster Management Committee has been mobilized. Zaid Hamidi has been made chair of that committee. What would you like to see him prioritize in the short term? I know that we have this the R1 billion flood mitigation project that is meant to help reduce some of our flooding woes in the future. But for the short term, Dr. Ashikin, what would you like Zaid Hamidi to prioritize?
A lot, actually. So, unfortunately, actually, I know that every year our country announces flood mitigation budget, but we are still having flood as our annual events because there is not much information on the flood mitigation project. So we don't have much transparency in flood risk governance. So I would like to make a flood simulation just to check how much that our flood mitigation project will help us to mitigate the flooding. But since there is not much information, so we can't make any simulation for that. But in terms of Zaid Hamidi chairing the Central Disaster Management Committee, I would like him to focus on the flood preparedness, since we are now in the phase of flood preparedness. Every single thing we have to prepare, including the evacuation center, the warning system. Please make use of the data of population living in flood-prone area. And since NADMA is under the jurisdiction of Prime Minister Office, I would like to recommend to issue one executive order that responder can act without the order of NADMA. This is to avoid the delay in operation like last year. And please ensure our logistic assets in good condition, add more manpower, and every year we can see that our evacuation center will get inundated, and so this is because we don't use any scientific or geographical data in selecting the evacuation center. So I would like our government to start analyzing the site suitability of evacuation center so that we can, improvise in terms of that.
You mean the evacuation center itself gets flooded?
Yeah, every year.
The evacuation center for the flood victims gets flooded because they haven't picked the right location. Okay, Dr. Ashikin, my last question to you is, just now you said you wish that there'd be more transparency in the 15 billion ringgit flood mitigation project. That's a very excellent point. And I do want to ask you, what do we know about it so far? How do we know that this is going to work, that this is going to be a successful project in mitigating floods in the long term?
Unfortunately, I cannot answer that because I tried to Google. I know for so many hours trying to find information about this flood mitigation project, but I can't find any. That's why I mentioned that if I can get the information, not just me, but other researchers, we can make a proper flood simulation and flood projection. So this will help our country, especially the government, to prepare if they need significant, improvement for the specific measure. So, but since there is no information, so we cannot tell whether the project will be successful or not.
Dr. Ashkim, thank you so much for speaking with me. I appreciate your time. Dr. Nurul Ashkim Abawi, a researcher in flood management risk there. And that wraps up this episode of Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris, signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching, and good night.